Freedom of trade has always been like the pulse of global peace, right? It's fascinating how history shows that when markets are open, wars tend to be kept at bay.
Absolutely. It's like a natural balance. When nations are trading freely, they're often interdependent, which promotes stability.
Exactly. And back in 1921, the Free Trade League of America passionately argued that free trade was key to world peace.
Right.
They warned that tariff barriers could lead directly to conflicts.
It's almost ironic, isn't it? They pointed out that trade struggles like protests against tariffs have historically set the stage for war.
Yeah. Take the Megarian Decree in ancient Greece, for instance. Athens imposed trade restrictions on Megara, and that contributed to the Peloponnesian Wars.
Right, and then you've got examples from the 17th century with the English-Dutch conflicts, not to mention the American Revolutionary War and even the War of 1812.
Absolutely. It's like trade barriers have been the trigger, or at least a major spark in so many conflicts over the centuries.
Yeah. But here's something to consider. Doesn't it seem a bit exaggerated to say tariffs are the sole cause of war?
Well, that's a valid point. It's not that tariffs alone cause wars, but they can amplify nationalistic tensions and make the environment ripe for conflict.
True. It's more like they add fuel to an already blazing fire of geopolitical rivalry, isn't it?
Exactly. Take Trump's tariffs on China and even on Canada. Those actions have really sort of reignited simmering tensions. Historically, such measures have often escalated disputes past the point of mere economic disagreement.
And then there's the idea of decoupling economies. When countries stop trading with each other, they remove that mutual dependency, which sometimes lowers the barrier to conflict.
Right. It's like when you're so intertwined, any conflict threatens your own economic survival, making you think twice about going to war.
Absolutely. That makes me wonder, in this modern context, could stringent tariffs between big players like the US and China actually lead, directly or indirectly, to actual military confrontation?
Well, it's a slippery slope. Think, for example, of the U.S. oil embargo on Japan in 1941. It's one of the sparks that ignited the attack on Pearl Harbor.
Yeah, indeed.
The current trade wars may not always erupt in open, armed conflict, but they certainly heighten the tension.
And you mentioned the idea of decoupling. If the economies are already disentangling, then nations might feel emboldened to confront each other because the usual economic risks are minimized.
Yes, it's like if you're already on separate paths economically, the mutual deterrence factor is significantly weakened, which could lead to a dangerous free-for-all scenario.
Right, exactly. But isn't there also a counter-argument that trade wars, by threatening economic penalties, can actually force dialogue and negotiation?
That's true. You know, in theory, tariffs can force countries to the negotiation table. However, history seems to suggest that once you start down that road, it's hard to stop the escalation because national pride gets so heavily involved.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Nationalistic sentiments coupled with economic self-interest can turn even a temporary frustration into a long-standing conflict.
Right, and don't forget, nations like China have deep historical memories after enduring the so-called century of humiliation due to forced trade by Western powers. They're extremely sensitive to any form of economic coercion.
Exactly. So whenever the U.S. imposes tariffs citing unfair practices like intellectual property theft or currency manipulation, it's hitting a nerve that goes way deeper than just dollars and cents.
Exactly. It's almost like a historical echo.
Yeah.
Every time a trade barrier is set up, it reignites that memory of exploitation and coercion, making the political atmosphere even more volatile.
It's really striking how intertwined economic policy is with international relations. One misstep in tariffs can ripple out into global security issues.
Absolutely. The free trade proponents argue that markets, by their very nature, promote cooperation. When that's disrupted, listen, it's not just about higher prices. It's a potential catalyst for conflict.
Right, indeed. And it's interesting because while we talk about tariffs and trade wars as economic tools, they're really political tools too, aren't they?
Yes, exactly. They're like a double-edged sword. On one side, they can protect domestic industries, but on the other, they stir up nationalist fervor and even pander to political extremes.
But then sometimes those protective measures might be used to, try and rebalance a trade deficit or address unfair practices.
Yeah, that's often the argument made. The idea is to level the playing field.
Right.
But as history shows us, when these measures become too aggressive, say tariffs spiking up to 245%, you end up not with a recalibration, but with a complete shutdown of trade.
That sounds like a recipe for disaster. Decoupling economies so that you remove the natural deterrence against military action.
Absolutely. It's like once the interdependence is severed, the fear of mutual economic harm, which usually keeps things in check, is gone.
Yeah, indeed. I find it fascinating, though, how these economic conflicts, while not causing wars directly, set the stage for them. Kind of like a silent partner in international tensions.
Yes. You could say they create a pressure cooker environment. Especially with the current U.S.-China dynamic, every tariff, every sanction ripples through and intensifies not just economic, but potentially military tensions too.
Right on. I've seen some experts argue that while trade wars might not directly cause wars, they've always been a strong indicator, almost like a canary in the coal mine for broader geopolitical conflict.
That's spot on. Even figures like Kevin O'Rourke point out that wars tend to follow after trade barriers are put in place. It's a correlation that isn't necessarily causation, but it's a red flag nonetheless.
Yeah, absolutely. I do have one point to challenge, though. Aren't there instances where trade wars have led to positive renegotiations, kind of a reset of relations, rather than a slide into conflict?
That's a fair remark. And yes, sometimes these tensions do lead to negotiations and reforms rather than outright conflict.
Right.
However, too often the escalation, the buildup of national pride and economic isolation, tends to tip the balance towards a more adversarial stance.
I suppose it comes down to the broader political climate and the willingness of leaders to seek compromise rather than confrontation.
Exactly. It's all about the context. Leaders who are predisposed to nationalism might use these economic measures as a rallying cry, further destabilizing international relations.
Yes. So, in essence, while trade is a key element for peace, when nations start using tariffs as tools for political maneuvering, the risk of conflict only goes up.
Right. It's like walking a tightrope. Free trade, in theory, binds nations together. Trade wars, in contrast, create fissures. The historical narrative is clear. More trade often means a more peaceful world.
Absolutely. And looking forward, with the current U.S.-China tensions, the stakes are incredibly high. The lessons from history remind us that economic policies can have far-reaching consequences for global security.
Indeed, the balance is delicate. It's a reminder that economic decisions aren't made in isolation. They ripple out to affect international alliances, trust, and ultimately peace.
Right. This has been a really enlightening discussion on how trade, tariffs, and economic strategies are intertwined with the fabric of global conflict and cooperation.
Totally. It makes you appreciate the complexity behind every trade deal and tariff decision. Thanks for the chat, and let's hope leaders learn from the past to steer toward peace rather than conflict.
Agreed.